Here we go. All right, welcome everyone to our second masterclass in the series. We're going to be talking about impact measurement today with Keith from Spring, and I'll go into a little introduction of Spring in a second here. Communis.org, just a little bit of background for everyone that's joining us on the call who may not have heard about us before. We're a 501c3 nonprofit based in the US, but with a remote and global team. And we're a membership community of conveners. And by conveners, I mean any individuals or organizations that are committed to bringing others together to create some sort of catalytic social and or environmental impact. So this could look like event organizers, accelerators that work with social entrepreneurs, fellowship programs, chapter organizations that work with students, policy advocates, you name it, online resources for people, media, digital storytelling type of organizations, consultancies, leadership training. That is what we consider to be conveners, and we actually have examples of all of those in our community. This is our team. And we also do advisory services. So if you're looking to create a convening or support with your convening goals, a facilitation at an event, we have done that with many clients, both universities, corporations, and large philanthropic organizations. So if you have any questions about membership or advisory services, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat, but it's Sarah with an H @conveners.org. And so today I am so honored and excited to have Keith join us from Spring. He's the co-founder and CEO of Spring. Spring Activator was founded in 2014 with a simple but bold mission to accelerate and amplify the activities of purpose-driven leaders to create a more sustainable, equitable, and resilient world. And with that, I am going to stop sharing and pass it over to Keith.
Amazing. Thank you. It's been fantastic to be a part of the conveners community now for a couple of years, and so we've had a chance to meet some fantastic organizations and fellow change makers through conveners. So Sarah, thanks for having me here. So I'm excited to actually hopefully get a chance to meet everyone. Given that we have a small crew here to get started, what I'd love to do is just do a quick round of introductions just so we can all say hi to each other and know where we are and who we are. So for everyone here, I'll give you just a quick intro, and then I'll give you just a bit of more background on Spring in a minute. But I'm Keith. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Spring. We exist to change the world through innovation. What that means for us is that we work in 3 pillars. So we work in the entrepreneur world, the impact investor world, and then also in the ecosystem world. And so through that, we're able to work on a wide range of programs and support activities for all 3 of those pillars. We're headquartered in Vancouver, Canada, which is where I am today. And we also are active in about 45 communities around the world, spanning Southeast Asia, Latin America, a little bit in sub-Saharan Africa and the Pacific Islands, and then a little bit of the developing Southeast Europe, the former Yugoslavia. And so to give you a bit about me, I am an absolute chocoholic. It is my favorite dessert and snack all at the same time. So there you go. So maybe what I'll do is I'll hand it to the next person on my screen. And then when you're done doing a quick intro, please do introduce someone else. So I'll kick things off with Lynn. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. So I am a project manager with VI3 Hub, which is Vancouver Island Impact Investing Hub. It is a startup, but in a different way. So our hub is meant to bring education, research, and connection through experiential learning for not only students and faculty at our university, but the whole ecosystem of impact investing. So that includes government entities and investors, industry accelerators like Keith's. So helping connect people and point them in the right direction to get the help they need to get impact investing more financial backing and improve the connection. So that's my role.
Awesome. And who do you nominate to go next?
I see Jeff.
Hey everybody, I'm Jeff Pilasek. I'm with the Miller Center for Social Entrepreneurship. We are a global accelerator program housed at Santa Clara University in Santa Clara, California. Of course, I'm not there. I'm in Oakland, California right now. So Miller Center, we've supported over 1,000 social enterprises over the last maybe 17 or so years. We are focused generally on serving enterprises that are post-revenue, so not super early stage types of organizations. And we're focused in the areas of climate resilience, which would include climate smart agriculture, energy and water, as well as women's economic empowerment.
Amazing. Thanks, Jeff. Who would you like to nominate next?
How about Heda?
Thanks, Jeff. I'm Hedda. I'm from YGAP. I'm, as you might be able to tell, based in Melbourne, Australia. We do have teams, and we our accelerator program as well, and we run in Kenya, South Africa, Bangladesh, also in the Pacific. We run a WIHO program, so that's focused on supporting women-led ventures in Pacific Islands and across Africa as well. And I am the monitoring, evaluation and learning officer at YGAP. And I would like to pass on to the other Keith. I think there's another Keith.
Hi there, this is the other Keith. Forgive me, I was not, I'm not in a position currently to introduce myself in person. Wasn't aware we would be doing this, so accept my apologies, humbly. I learned about conveners. I don't have an organization as of yet. Listening in and listening in, I love your hairstyle then, Keith. Listening in, it's giving me a much better idea of what conveners are. I'm just a guy, honestly, that is from here in the United States, and I'm just a few hours south of Keith, and I'm in the Seattle area. And I was hoping to be in Kenya right now, actually. I had met a Kenyan entrepreneur, Yvonne Otenyo, and she runs a family-owned business that, in my ignorant American educated perspective, trumps the colonialist business model, in that she adds value to what otherwise would have been food waste, processes it in country, and then sells it off to in retail packages to the EU. And I first learned of her when she conducted a blockchain farm to table transaction between Kenya and Germany. And I believe it was stated was the first time it happened. I can't prove that or not, but it got me so excited 3 years ago. I've stayed in touch with her the whole time. And from trying to find funding to help her, I know Looney, some of you may know Looney here in the Seattle area, absolutely. And trying to figure out how to touch base with impact investors so that I can share their story. That's why I was going to Kenya, but it got canceled, unfortunately, with restrictions to internal country movement. We were going to go to visit some of the farming communities that she serves with this food waste solution that she has. And I was just funding it myself just because, you know, my dad died last year, and I said it's time for me to do something productive with the last 100% of my life. And yeah, I'm here learning. and looking forward to create something out of the beautiful passion that you all are sharing. And look forward to hearing more. Sorry for the long introduction, but thank you.
That's fantastic. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you, Keith. Honestly, I don't know anybody else, but I will acquiesce to you, Keith, to choose the next person, please.
Sounds good. Next on my list would be Anna.
Hey there, folks. Very similar to Keith a moment ago, in more ways than one. I'm in the Seattle area, and like Keith, I have volunteered in many community-led development projects in the past, and now I'm in a position to make a change and either develop a community-led program or join an existing program. So here to learn, joined OC to learn, joined everything to learn, and to expand my skill set to move forward. So, and luckily it's just now sunny in Seattle, so I'm a happy girl. So thank you.
Awesome.
Moving on. I'm sorry, I don't know who's on the participant list here. Let's see. Keith, what do you think? Who do we have? Sarah? Sarah, we have Deborah?
You can, I would say you can go for Paula. She's got
Paula,
her
there you
camera.
go, Paula. I see Paula. Perfect.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. I'm gonna try to keep my video on. My connection isn't great, so yeah, I might not be able to keep the video on the whole time. But anyway, hi everyone. It's very nice to meet you. My name is Paula Ochiel. I am with ICA, formerly known as Inner City Advisors. We are headquartered in Oakland, California, but I'm currently based in Lewiston, in Northern California. So it's kind of close to Seattle, maybe you could say. So we are sort of venture capital CDFI. For those of you who are not familiar with CDFI, as it stands for Community Development Financial Institutions, and they're basically community lenders in the U.S. that serve underserved communities, people that are don't have access to mainstream lending. And so we do equity-like investing in small businesses in the San Francisco Bay Area, but we also offer business advising as well as technical assistance. And my role is impact associate at the organization. And so, do everything impact data collection and understanding ways that we can improve the experience or the services that we offer to our borrowers. Side note, originally from Kenya, and I come from Western Kenya, so I was really excited when Keith mentioned Yvonne Otieno, and so I recognize that name, and that's really exciting. Yeah, great to be here.
It's amazing always when we're on calls like this, just to realize both how incredibly large and how tiny the world is, right? Like how it just all comes together. So thanks for that sharing. Last but not least is going to be Deborah.
Hi, I'll pop on. I'm sorry, I'm off video because I have two small children crawling all over me as I navigate their dinner. But I'm here and listening in. My name is Deborah Barron. I'm also in the Bay Area in California. I am in the East Bay, and I run a program called New Left Accelerator. And we work only in the United States. We work primarily in kind of target states and in the political sense that are, transforming into progressive spaces. And we do organizational capacity building for what we call power building organizations. So in the United States, our tax code has 501c3s, 501c4s, and like political action committees and a bunch of other type of legal entities. And so we do organizational capacity building for groups that are moving from 501c3 service-based into policy and political advocacy. And we help them make that journey into being organizations that build power within underserved communities. So we have a pretty political power building mission. And we've been in existence for about 4 years. Our accelerator classes are 2 years each. So we're kind of wrapping up our second class. And we work with an evaluator. But I definitely find that like a lot of our metrics are the success of the groups within our program, right? Like how successful were they, and figuring out what our own metrics, how we tell that story is something that I've kind of like struggled with in terms of, talking to donors and that type of stuff. We really expand the capacities of others, and money and things like that don't trade in our space, because it's not really impact investing, it's actually social impact. So I'm excited to be part of this community.
Amazing. And as you were sharing, Deborah, and feel free to, on and off video as is, kind of feasible with the family. It's one of the benefits of this COVID world is being on Zoom. We can live very kind of blended lives as we want to. So good for you. And so just to touch on that, you kind of raised this great question, how do we tell our own metrics, right? And especially in speaking with donors and funders. And that's a great question that we will actually dig into as a part of today's session. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a quick screen share with everybody. And I'm going to just cover off a few quick things just to get things rolling. And just again, just really appreciate conveners.org and your supporter Innovation Exchange for allowing me to be a part of this masterclass series. So thank you. Formally, we're going to chat a bit about impact measurements, some approaches, some considerations, hopefully get into some practical next steps. And then as a part of that also, oh, it's funny, it says agenda item. It would stop at practical next steps. So there you go. And so just to give you a bit of background on Spring and how we view the world. So we at Spring, there are 6 SDGs that we are specifically focused on as an organization. And I'm sharing that for 2 reasons. One is so that you get a sense as to just where we are today. But second, that we as an organization view this as a journey, right? We see this as an evolving process for Spring. When we first started the organization, there were 4 SDGs. We have now evolved to 6 based on a mix of the work that we're doing, the scope upon which we're doing it, as well as the team has grown over time, that, bringing in some of the personal values and personal goals and objectives of the team and kind of coalescing that into our area of focus. And so this is one of the important places that we go as Spring as we start to ground ourselves in impact measurement. So just to start to lay some groundwork, what I'd love to do is I'd just love to come off of screen share again, just for a quick moment. And what I'd love to hear is what are the burning questions, or what are the challenges that you're facing around impact measurement? And the reason I'm asking, of course, is because if I'm already planning on covering it, great. But if it's something I'm not, then I can adapt in and make sure that we cover it off, at least in part. And so for your burning questions or challenges, you have a choice. You can either come off of mute, or if you want, you can just type it into chat as best works for you. So love to hear what your questions and challenges are, and then we can take it from there. And don't be shy. Go ahead, Lynn.
Yeah, I can start. So it's interesting when you were talking about the evolution, you started with 4 SDGs and then you went to 6. And I think for startup companies or organizations, it's just the fact of how do you lay that framework and then do the metrics to measure it. So for instance, you have the 6 that you identified, but how are you measuring that, or how do you communicate that to a potential investor?
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for that. Great question. And then Sarah asked the question in chat: how can we best support entrepreneurs in the global South with less access to resources in measuring their impact? And Sarah, first, that's a great question. Second of all, it can also be a question that is in many of the developed countries that we work in, including in North America, for those organizations that we might call micro enterprise, new organizations that just don't have the resources and the scope yet potentially to do that kind of impact measurement. So Sarah, great question. Any other questions or challenges that you're facing? And Jeff's got his hand up. So Jeff, over to you.
I have a slightly different angle on this question. And so, we support a lot of entrepreneurs and we kind of teach them how to do some ways to measure impact. I think what we've been challenged with is how do we best communicate the impact that we're having with our funders, with Miller Centrist funders. So we want to roll up, all the impact across all the organizations we're working with in some way to make a compelling story and case for the funders. And I know it's something we've wrestled with for a while. And Keith, Keith and I know each other a little bit. I know Keith's a very smart guy, so I'm here to
no pressure.
Steal your ideas.
Good. Yeah, I will definitely say to everybody here, shamelessly, the vast majority of what we do around impact measurement has come from watching others in action and kind of gleaning from others' activities. So love to say that we were super creative and we came up with all of our ideas, but that might be a lie. One thing that I do want to share with people is what's interesting here is there's already starting to be one trend in this mix, which is storytelling, right? So when Deborah first shared, she's like, how can we share this impact when we're speaking with donors and funders? Jeff, you've touched on the same thing. And Lynn, you also talked about that as well. Like, how do we convey the impact that we're creating? And so I think that that's a really important part. And then Hedda says, I'm keen to gather more qualitative data. Would like to hear what your experience might be and also how I might be able to shadow someone conducting most significant change interviews, for example. Oh, that's such a fantastic question. And so what was interesting is that when I was doing this talk about 6 hours ago, this was actually a really big topic of conversation. It's like, how do we tackle the qualitative, and how do we dig into things, that maybe are a little bit harder to kind of wrap specific quantitative metrics around. So we will talk about that as we go through. Any final questions that anybody wants to ask?
Yeah, I have a question similar to Jeff's question on how to communicate impact to funders. And it's basically like, how do we move from tracking outputs to tracking outcomes and impact? So, going beyond, this is how much we've raised, this is how much capital we've raised, this is how much capital we've deployed to entrepreneurs or what we consider output metrics, to broader, kind of more meaningful, if you can call it, impact metrics that communicate what we are doing to our funders. Has been something we grapple with a lot at ICA.
Great. Fantastic question, Paula. Really, thank you for kind of digging in on that next layer with what Jeff shared. And I think it's a layer that we're all kind of grappling with at different levels. And what's interesting is that this can be grappled with at an individual organization level, like what Keith was sharing with the organization he's working with. And of course, it can be with a cohort of entrepreneurs, or it can be cohort of cohorts, right? And so Deborah, thinking about this capacity building that you're doing and then the impact that they're having out there. And so interestingly enough, as I go through, I'll actually be giving a bit of case study that will reflect that one in particular. So what I'm going to share over the next hour. I'm
sorry, Keith, could I?
Yeah, please dive in.
Move on. When you're talking about the qualitative aspects of the organizations, are you also looking, is that in a sense, and I'm a beginner here, kind of by the participation of let's say the organizations here with those entrepreneurs, with those movements that they are supporting, like the aliveness that's created within those organizations because of, let's say, our participation with them, our investment with them. So not just the quantitative results that they've achieved because of our investment, but is the qualitative in that sense? Do you understand what I mean by the aliveness, the the commitment that's been invigorated within the organization, is that along the qualitative lines that you're talking about?
Yeah, so I think you're touching on one dimension for sure. And what's interesting is Hedda referred to the most significant change interview as a method by which you can start to dig into these topics. What I will share with you is we at Spring, one of the ways that we create a baseline for this conversation is when we talk to entrepreneurs who have gone through our program, do we hear the statement at any point in time, this program has changed my life? And just so that everybody knows, that's the exact phrase we're looking for. And the reason for that is because the very first time we ran a cohort at Spring and we got to the demo day, we had an entrepreneur get up on stage and say, you know, this is my idea and da 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 da. And then at the end, and they said, I just want to say thank you to Spring because, you know, when I came into this program, I saw these, challenges, and now that I've come this far, I can see my potential for impact in this program's changed my life. And when they said that, the donors and funders in the room, like, you just knew it was like, okay, well, I'll just email you the proposal. Like, you could just tell. And so, but that's a nice summation of what you're describing. And so sometimes, and an earlier example from the earlier session, we were talking about one situation with an ESO, or ecosystem support organization, for those who haven't heard that term, where one ESO was saying, hey, sure, we track jobs, but like, what's the quality? Like, are those good jobs, right? And how are those jobs changing the life outcomes of the people who get those jobs? And so that's another kind of place where you can start to think about this intersection between a baseline of quantitative data and then how you wrap qualitative data around it. So I think that's great. Great point. Great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a bit of a screen share. And as I go through this screen share, my intent here is to share some of the things that we have learned and done at Spring, which by no means I will advocate as best practice, but just as what we have gone through as a journey. I will also be sharing a very specific case study, which I know will resonate with at least a few of you on this call. I think on a macro basis, it should resonate with everybody, but let's play it out and see what happens. Yeah, and I'm just reading Deborah's comment here. Yeah, I agree with that comment. And so the important part, Deborah, is, there are very obvious things that we can do. And so sometimes I talk about it as like Maslow's hierarchy of impact. At the bottom here is like, jobs created and companies supported and, funding raised and revenue and living wages. So there's a few things we can nail at the bottom of the pyramid, but then how do we start to wrap these things that both take us up the pyramid and also are sometimes hidden behind the scenes? And so something that we'll chat about here as we dig in. So I'm going to just pop back on my screen share here for a minute and just very quickly, I'm going to get my chat up. So I do have my chat up. So if you guys pop anything into chat, I'm ready to go. So I'm going to advocate for a few things. And so as we go through this exercise, now let me see here. In theory, I can see all of you at the same time. So I'm just going to try and prove that. Great. Okay, I got everybody up. So this is the quintessential show of hands moment. And so what I always find is when we as organizations are thinking about how we are going to be measuring impact, and I love the fact that earlier we had this conversation about like, how do I measure impact for ourselves? And then how do I also measure it for others, like donors and funders? And so what often happens, and to be fair for everybody, I'm kind of looking straight at Sarah and Jeff on this one, because I know that you guys have similar battle scars to me of being in this space for a while. And so the reason I'm saying that is because sometimes we get to a place as an organization where the things that we're trying to measure are a byproduct of all of the individual little programs that we're trying to run and projects. And so what happens is we start to lose sight of the forest for the trees. And so one of the first things that I'll share with you for spring is that we actually take a step back and a step up once every 6 months. And we actually say, so what are we measuring and why? And the reason is because it's so easy to get caught up in what happens in an individual program and kind of go down the rabbit hole of trying to measure everything for a specific program. And it can create this kind of unwieldy monster that we're trying to like measure everything. And it creates a lot of unnecessary noise. The important part for us as an organization is that we always as well start with who the customer is. And we're going to talk about this more in a moment. The third step is to build the framework and to be pragmatic about it. We'll also chat a bit about that. The fourth one that I'm going to mention is fair exchange of value. And so for all of us, ultimately, we're counting on other people to do the measuring for us. And so, Sarah, you gave the example, right? In the global South, we're asking these entrepreneurs to measure and say, give us your impact measurements, right? We're doing it actually everywhere in the world. And the tricky part is, for people like myself and Deborah, Sarah with conveners for sure on this list. I think, Jeff, you've done it a couple of times as well. When we also then do things like programs and training for other ESOs, for other incubators and accelerators, now we're even more arm's length. We're asking that ESO to then go measure and then bring the whole thing back to us, right? And so at the end of the day, we have to acknowledge that, we're working with human beings and they will do things altruistically to a point, but, we are asking people a lot of them and we need to be thoughtful about that. And then this battle of quantitative versus qualitative and living in a healthy tension there, I think is really important. This is my show of hands moment, and my show of hands moment for those who are on screen. And if you're off camera, you can come on camera for a minute. But my question is, how many of you would say that you have linked your mission vision, or if you've done a theory of change as an organization, how many of you have actually gone through an exercise of directly linking your theory of change or your mission vision with what you're measuring? Show of hands. So there's an ish, right? There's an ish. Paula, I'm going to say Paula has an emphatic hand up, but that's because all I can see is the animated hand. So Paula, you'll get the emphatic. That's great. Hedda as well. So the important part that I find, and the second show of hands would be for those who said yes, how many of you have revisited that in the last, say, 6 months? So Jeff has, Fab. Now, Hedda, I don't know if you are thinking, like, if that's still the hand from before, or if it's a new hand. So
That was the hand from before, but we're just been revising a new vision and mission. So we're currently thinking through all of this right now.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. And so the reason I'm sharing that is because I think that's one of the challenges for us as ESOs and as support organizations is sometimes we're like auto mechanics, right? When you go to the auto mechanic shop, the worst looking car in the parking lot is the mechanics, because we spend all that time, helping other people, never get around to our own stuff. And so I think that's really important. So I just, for me, wanted to share a few things. Of course, metrics are being increasingly mandated in many industries and by many donors and funders and partners. I'm not saying anything you don't already know. I think what's been interesting over the last couple of years is that you can see that donors, funders, corporate sponsors, sometimes other stakeholders are really starting to blend in financial returns with impact returns. So where maybe historically there was a donor, funder, or a sponsor who was explicitly about impact, starting to weave in the economic returns and the economic impact even more, and then vice versa, seeing the other side come in. And then, shout out to Paula. I think it was Paula who talked about measuring not just outputs, but also outcomes. So these are some of the considerations that come into play. And And so what we have found at Spring is that when we have done this ourselves and when we've supported other people to do it, is that we say, let's get grounded into our mission, vision, values. Let's get grounded into our theory of change, and let's make sure that we're linking that with what we measure. Because otherwise we will get lost in the trees of either our own individual projects or in what the disparate sort of demands are of donors and funders and other stakeholders. And so just to show you how we've done it at Spring is that we've actually created a link between and a theory of change, which brings us measurements. So the link between the needs and problems we're trying to solve, the individual actions that we're a part of, and then what we're actually trying to achieve as outcomes, and therefore what we might be measuring. And the reason I'm sharing this with you, and I can, you can have a copy of this deck through Sarah and the conveners team afterwards, so you don't need to worry about reading the whole thing. But the reason I wanted to share it with you is because I think what I'm sharing with you here, for those who have done theory of change before, you're like, yes, Keith, I see this and that makes sense. We understand it. What we have done at Spring, though, is we've actually taken it down to the pillar level as well. So this is Spring Corp. But then what we've also done is we've taken it into our core pillars. So this is the theory of change for the entrepreneur pillar and what we're doing specifically for them. And then specifically, what do we need to be measuring for the entrepreneurs? And then we've done the same thing with the investor pillar. And so just to give everybody a bit of a sense, at Spring, I would say we are probably now almost halfway through 2021. We're pretty close to being about, say, 50-50 in terms of like entrepreneur programs and activities and investor programs and activities. And so for us, we actually really felt that it was important to take it down to the next level and dig into what it is that we are working towards, and how that kind of will help to inform what we do as impact measurement. And so just noting that Sarah dropped in the chat, how many years you all follow the entrepreneurs you support once they exit the program, or exit an investment for those of investment fund. And so Sarah, maybe the question that I would have for you is, are you asking that question in part because of the notion of additionality? So how long will our impact actually have an impact on the organization before it's just the team doing their thing and they get other support from other people? Is that kind of like where you're driving towards?
Yeah, it's sort of the impact that happens, yeah, after the fact that you can actually say was partially due to either your program if you're an accelerator incubator, or your investment if you're an investor as well.
Great.
Yeah.
And so Hedda has responded with 2 years. And then we're still figuring this out. Great, Deborah. So I'm actually going to share with you how we do it as well at Spring, specifically on the question of additionality. And Jeff is 3 years. And so these are great examples. And I think the important part for everybody here is Hedda's doing 2 years, Jeff is doing 3. They're both right? Like, I think what you do is you look at the nature of the program or programs, how long you're spending with them, what is the nature of, the target outcomes and what is achieved. You will pick a number here that feels right for the team and feels right for the organization, I think. And Jeff, you could comment on this. I'm sure part of that number as well is just over time working with so many entrepreneurs, you get to a place where you're like, yeah, we really feel like this is the right number for us based on what we do and how we do it. Is that kind of a fair representation of how you've come to that number so far?
Well, I can tell you, I joined Miller Center about 3 years ago, and we've had a conversation about this from the first day I joined. There was, we had been sort of tracking or trying to measure people indefinitely. And we were all like, well, that's wrong, right? That can't be right. But we also, it's complicated for us because we work with some of these entrepreneurs post-acceleration as well. And so we run a number of programs that they continue to participate in. We supply sometimes fellows and stuff that work with the social enterprises. So, when's the start and end date gets a little tricky, but yeah.
Yeah, well said. Well said. And Hedda actually commented in a similar way in terms of like, not only how long can you collect data before it just doesn't feel right, and then the second one is how long before they just stop answering your questions, right? And I did this fun show of hands in the morning session where we were talking about this. The challenge as well is that the entrepreneur's memory is like our memory. It's flawed, right? And so, the show of hands that I would love to ask, and I know Jeff can answer this and probably Sarah as well. I'm not sure about everybody else, but I will raise the comment, which is, how many times have we been in a situation where we support an entrepreneur, we make an introduction, and they're like, oh, like you changed my life, or like that had a profound effect on the track of success and impact for my business. Like, how many of us have heard that comment at least once, right? And the reality is we probably all have heard it multiple times. And then how many of those people, like 4 years later, when they achieve success, and they reference that same thing, and then you're like, yeah, it was so great, that we did that during the program, and they're like, you did that? We did that in the program, So, selective memory kills us every time, right? And so I will definitely honor that comment. I will share as well. Hey, they remember us. They just don't remember what we did for them. That's the problem, And so, yeah, so it's fun. But I will touch on this kind of like additionality, and also, Jeff, you referenced something in terms of your follow-on programs that I think is actually really critical for everybody here to kind of dig into in our own respective organizations and our work. And I will share a little bit of reference in the spring context as well. So one thing that I would ask at this point in time is to just see how everybody reacts to this one-word question, which is, who is your customer? And feel free to put it into chat, or you can come off of mute, either way. But who's your customer? Entrepreneurs, mentors, funders, conveners from around the globe, fantastic. Leaders of power building organizations, funders, entrepreneurs. Yeah. Yeah, entrepreneurs, students, great. And so you're really definitely hitting on some of the key people. And so the reason I mention that is because at the end of the day, we all run, in a manner of speaking, a marketplace organization, right? And so the reason that I mention that is because we need to be thoughtful as we're thinking about impact measurement, about who we're measuring for and why. And so it is not uncommon for us as ESOs to actually, at some level, potentially be reporting impact metrics to any combination or all of these organizations. And so we heard about entrepreneurs, clients, right? And so Deborah, I'll put your, power building organizations under clients, just for simplicity's sake here. Some of us have government, some of us have donors, corporate sponsors, investors. What's interesting is that even with Sarah, like when she talks about conveners from around the globe, like some of those are incubators and accelerators. Some of them are individual consultants. Some of them are, impact funds. You definitely have a spectrum within this mix. And what's interesting is, as I was thinking about Keith and what you're doing with the organization in Africa, is acknowledging that if they're doing impact measurement, they're doing impact measurement for themselves. They're doing impact measurement for investors. They're potentially doing it for partners, right? So we always want to think about, like, who are we doing this for and why, and really making sure that first, what I've done is I've gone through and I've said, here's my mission vision, here's my theory of change, and therefore what should we be measuring? And then what we do is we then stress test that against these groups and make sure that we're covering them. And it's really important for us to do that. And part of it, just so that I can say it out loud, and feel free to debate me on this. Sometimes when government is one of our key stakeholders and looking for impact measurement, they're looking at the classic, right? Like throughput of programs, jobs created, sales growth, funding raised. They might be looking at things like gender distribution of the participants. So they have a kind of core set, right? But then when we get into some donors sometimes will really move up Maslow's hierarchy of impact, right? And they're looking for some very specific metrics according to their mandate and what they're trying to achieve with you in the program. So I think it's important for us always to have this group in focus when we're moving forward. And so what I'm going to do from here on in is I am going to link to a case study just to give a bit of real time and also realism to this. So I'm going to reference the Swiss Entrepreneurship Program. And so Sarah, ironically, I built this deck, and then lo and behold, this morning, one of the team members from Swiss Entrepreneurship Program showed up. And I was like, oh, I hope I got my numbers right. And so to make a long story short, this program started 6 years ago, and it's a Swiss government funded program. So how many people here think that the Swiss government is driven by precision, right? Clearly. And so what was interesting is that this program was funded by the Swiss government, and it's a program that spans 7 countries, which, by the way, for everybody here, it doesn't matter that it's 7 countries, it could be 7 cities. It just happens to be 7 countries, it's 7 jurisdictions, right? And so it's a government funded program. And when they built it, they said, okay, we need to measure our impact. And so when they went through this process, they built a rubric that had 68 metrics, equally weighted. And so the challenge for them was compounded by the fact that they did not directly support the entrepreneurs or investors. They actually supported ecosystem support organizations like incubators and accelerators in these different communities. And then they would work with the entrepreneurs, which meant that they needed to convince the incubators and accelerators to go and chase down the numbers from all their entrepreneurs and then bring it all back to them. And so it literally was a full-time job for 2 people per country for 6 weeks, full-time, every 6 months. And then at the end of their phases, which are 4 years in duration, it would be like a minimum of 12 weeks. And so what happened is that they called me as they got to the end of phase 1. They had been approved for phase 2. It was a big dogfight with the Swiss government to get it, even though they had some pretty good metrics. And they just looked at me and they said, Keith, like, we can't keep doing this. And so what happened is we kind of started to dig into the process, and I'm going to kind of weave this through as we kind of talk through this next set of pieces. And so where we started with Spring, and this is a process that I replicated with Swiss EP and then also with some other organizations, is we just started by creating a baseline. And so in the baseline, and my guess actually is, for example, with Paula and Hedda and the roles that you play, you've probably been through some variation of this, whether it was actually from scratch in the beginning or evolution. But first, we're defining the overall metrics. So again, we started with our own based on mission, vision, and or theory of change. And then the second thing is to identify what is actually meaningful for each stakeholder. And then as a part of that, we also then need to think about what is our unit metric of growth. And the reason for that is because we as organizations were often talking about growth with our donors, funders, and corporate sponsors. So, a great example that I like to give here, and this was an accidental realization, is that I was speaking to somebody at the end of the first year of Spring, and they said, "Oh, what have you been up to?" And then I said, "Oh, so yeah, it's been a busy year, and here's some of the metrics," and gave them A, B, and C. And then I talked to that same funder a year later, and they said, "Oh, so what's new?" And then I said, "Oh, well, this happened, and one of the things that happened as well is that over the course of the year, we had helped our ventures raise about $5 million in early stage impact capital. And the donor just about fell out of their chair. They're like, wow, is that amazing progress? And I was like, noted. I'm going to write this one down and I'm going to remember this for the future. And so, but the important part is that for each one of us, the metric of growth can mean many different things. And it can mean direct as well as by extension, as in the case of Deborah, right? Like Deborah capacity builds a new power org. They then go and do X, and there's this amplification effect, right? Or in Jeff's case, he could say in 2020, we ran 16 programs. In 2021, we're actually going to be running 20 programs. Or it might actually be the same number of programs, but more participants, or more gender lens participants, or, right? So the important part here is we want to be able to define growth and progress in a way that is important for us and creates maximum impact, and then convey that well to the other stakeholders in our community. I will say, just as an aside, if we are inviting impact entrepreneurs into our programs, we need to show them that we hustle and that we deliver in our metrics, right? Because especially in 2021, impact entrepreneurs and change makers have phenomenal choice to get help from a lot of different places, right? There's a lot of ESOs out there. There's a lot of programs out there. There's a lot of support out there. And so we need to be able to convey to them why we're special, right? And we are. We just need to make sure that we tell the story, right? And by the way, while I was saying that, I was looking directly at Lindsay, because we're based in Canada. And so we don't say, hi, my name is Keith. We say, sorry, my name is Keith. We never market ourselves. So we really have to work at it. So, yeah. So the other piece is, we at Spring, and we've seen some other people do this, we try and establish a baseline, like, where do we think the company could go? And when I say company, sorry, just to take a step back, regardless of legal structure, right? It could be a nonprofit, charity, co-op, for-profit, we don't care, but for the organization, what do we think they could achieve without us, without our program, without our support, without our solution? And then try and then say, okay, where does that go? And so sometimes you can use base economic metrics, information that you can get from economic development offices. Like, there's ways to say, okay, here's a typical trajectory. People come through our program, ergo, here's the new trajectory. What's important, for example, Deborah, in your case, is when you're supporting new power organizations, as for example, Jeff and I and Sarah and I sometimes support ESOs, is things like financial sustainability, because being an ESO is hard. And so if we're able to support them well, one of the metrics that we actually track is there an increase in financial sustainability relative to the norm? And so that's something to think about. And so these are some of the steps that we go through to start to build a baseline of, what it is that we want to measure and how.
Can I ask a quick question? Sorry.
Yeah, please, absolutely. And let me know if you need me to go back to the slide or not.
Yes, please. So
Great.
yeah, on your point about defining a baseline through research, how do you?
Correct.
I imagine, like, it can get really complicated, in thinking about, like, even if there are research or sources of data that you can use to establish, a way that tells you where your participants, your customers are, or where they could be without your services. I mean, I can imagine a scenario where it gets really complicated, because you're like, well, if I'm not offering the services, maybe someone else is going to offer the services that I'm not. And so how do you account for that? Because usually, maybe sometimes you'll find research that doesn't necessarily account for that. Anyway, I don't know if I'm making sense.
No, you're making sense. And what I would say, Paula, is the question that you're asking, where we have gone at Spring and where I've seen other people go, is the question that you pose based on the nature of the question and the level of complexity of getting to the answer also helps us to define whether or not what we're going to measure is going to be primary, secondary, or tertiary. So one example that I would give everybody is, there are metrics out there about what is the success rate of companies that try and raise capital from angel investors and venture capital funds. So there's no metrics out there that says, for the average company that tries to raise money, X% actually do. And of those that actually do, they tend to raise X amount of money on average, right? And so then what we do at Spring is we say, okay, if we know that number and then we run people through our investment readiness program, we can measure the success rate and we can measure the average raise. For us, that feels like a pretty good metric. Like that for us is a good metric where we can say, relative to the norm, this is what we're able to achieve. We consider that to be a secondary metric because we're not 100% sure what other support they may or may not be getting. But we also believe that we're having an influence. Thus, it's secondary, not tertiary. So I think the important part is to say, like, at what level of confidence will then help you determine whether or not you're calling it a primary metric, a secondary metric, or tertiary, because of that confidence level. So how much are you interpolating? How much of it are you extrapolating? And then at a certain point in time, to be clear, sometimes you look at the number and you say, we're just not going to be able to measure this. And that's okay. The important part is to revisit those from time to time based on either evolutions in the program and or evolutions in data gathering techniques, et cetera. So those would definitely be key considerations from my perspective. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Fabulous. Yeah, great question. Keep them coming for sure. So some considerations. Precision is required, obviously, when we're getting into economic valuation. There's always this question and debate about can qualitative, it's funny, I made this mistake this morning. I didn't fix it. So I owe everybody a beer post-COVID. Can qualitative metrics become quantitative metrics at scale? So there's an interesting question. Some people love to ask that question and dig in. Paula preempted this comment here, what are primary, secondary, and tertiary goals and or metrics? So, what are we trying to achieve there? And so what are some of the risks to the framework? So how long does the impact last? We were just having this conversation about 2 years, 3 years, et cetera. What is this additionality contribution? And the example here that I like to give is % of capital raised after the program. Because if anybody here watches anything in tech, right, like Y Combinator, Techstars, everybody else are like, our companies have raised 56 billion, or, they have an enterprise value of 27 billion, or whatever the number is, and they're just taking credit for everything, that's the classic, don't confuse the sale with the install. But I think for us as impactors, we're all fighting with that question. So a couple of things that I would say, with questions like additionality, with questions like, sorry, completely brain dead there. Some of these, I'll just have to go back. Sorry, just end of the day. Creating a baseline. Right. So creating a baseline through research, like, what could they achieve without our solution? So when we get into the big questions, sometimes they're philosophical questions, like additionality can sometimes get to become a philosophical question. And some of the other sort of topics that we've had coming up here as well. So the reason I mentioned that around qualitative data would be another example, is there's a couple things that we have as rules and guidelines at Spring. So first is no one's allowed to ask a philosophical question except in July. And that's going to sound like a funny question, but the reason I say that, for many of you, you're probably like me, our business is seasonal. So from January 15th to June 15th, my team doesn't have time to breathe. Like, we're full on, like, we have 6 programs on the go right now. Like, there's just no time or space for a philosophical question. And so what we do is we say, okay, our downtime historically is July and August. And it also happens to be the start of our fiscal year, July 1. So what we do is that's our big 6-month review. That's when we, as an organization, we can take July, we can debate these philosophical questions, And then if we can put some of them into action, we'll put them into action in August. And then we run in our second seasonal sprint, which is September 15th to December 15th, right? And then third week of December, we do a quick checkpoint. How are we doing? Great, go from there. And then around things like additionality, here are our timeframes. So for incubation, it's 2 years. For acceleration, it's 3. And then for investment readiness, so this is a specific program that we have to help people raise capital. Impact Ventures raising capital from impact sources of capital, it's 7 years. And the reason it's 7 years is because for anybody who has been through this process of raising capital, typically a scaling impact venture will raise multiple rounds of capital, right? So Keith was talking about this venture, and there's a reasonable likelihood they'll raise 1 or more, probably sometimes 3 or 4 rounds of capital. And the reason that we will give ourselves at least some amount of credit for 7 years is because the terms and conditions and the amount raised and the strategic value of the investors in the round that we support, which is almost inevitably the first round of capital, that will have cascading impact on the future rounds. And so in that case, we draw a direct connection between, kind of the work that we do in that first round and what they're going to do in subsequent rounds, and which tends to kind of map out on average about 7 years. So that's the reason why we map according to those numbers. So just to give you a bit of a sense as to how we tackle that. Yeah, so that's great. And then one other thing that's really important is when we get into the big questions, we actually use a framework like this to help us decide what questions we are going to tackle when we're ready to tackle them. And so one example that I would give you as we step into July of 2021 is that you can see here on the page that gender is either an 8 or a 9 for kind of our big 3, right? So for ourselves and for donors and for corporate sponsors. And what I will tell you is when we update this at the beginning of July, it's going to be 10s across the board. Gender is an absolute priority across the board. And so what that means is we will dig into some of the philosophical questions, the qualitative data capture that comes about in that particular vertical so that we can dig deeper, because it's becoming more and more important for us as Spring, as an org, as well as for those people that we work with. So it's a great way for us also to pick and choose these qualitative / philosophical questions that we want to dig into. So just giving you an example of a tool that we use at Spring to help do that. So I'm back to our case study. When we went through this process of establishing the baseline, and in establishing the baseline for Swiss EP, we talked to the Swiss government, we talked to the Swiss contact leadership team, we also talked to the incubators and accelerators they were working with, and we actually took the 68 metrics and we boiled it down to 7. And based on 7 metrics, we then said, okay, of the core 7 metrics, yes, there are 20 metrics that we would consider to be secondary and tertiary. So we went overall from 68 to 27, but 7 primary, and then the remaining 20 are secondary, tertiary. And those were the ones that were important. And what was amazing is that we actually got a renewal on the program. So to give everybody some context, a 16 million euro program, we got a renewal on that with the Swiss government with 7 metrics, 7 numbers. That was it. And so the reason is because sometimes we get really caught up in what we believe is important, but when we actually boil it down, we can actually get it down to the critical number. And yes, in those numbers were some very basic numbers like jobs created and program throughput and funding raised, of course. But there were also some other critical metrics. One thing that was very interesting is that in the 68 metrics, one of the things that was buried in there was gender. And then heading into the program, gender, like the gender support is core to 2 of the 7 metrics. So it's a really, really great example of how it actually really helped to bring forward some of the priorities that was important, not only to the core organization, but also to their primary funder, in this case, the Swiss government. And so we will continue on in this context. So What do we want to measure? So I'm going to raise up some tools here. And I'm actually going to raise maybe a topic for conversation. Let's see how this plays out. So most everybody on this call will have heard of Gin Iris Plus. It is the Bible of impact metrics. And I'm not sure if I call it the Bible because it's the gospel truth, or it's just really a very thick book. And so Gin Iris Plus is, it's, I think 650, somebody here probably knows the exact number, but it's about 650 metrics that you can pick and choose from. And so the important part here, of course, is to be judicious. Project Drawdown has become very, very popular with donors and funders around anything related to climate tech, clean energy, circular economy. Like it is front and center. And so that is something definitely worth digging into. Impact management project is becoming something that I'm hearing more and more people dig into. We personally at Spring have not yet leveraged it, but definitely hearing a fair bit about it. We'll be digging into it actually this summer as a part of our downtime to see what might be relevant for us. But the reason I'm sharing all of that is because those are frameworks that we can all draw on. But Deborah, thanks for asking. Impact management project is actually a tool. It's a platform that you can use to do impact measurement. So it's kind of cut from a similar cloth as the other ones that are listed here. So so that's what I'm specifically referring to. You should be able to Google it and it should show up immediately. If for whatever reason it doesn't, let me know, I'll get you the link. Sometimes we in the impact world are not great at doing our own SEO. So I'm assuming they're at the top of the pile when you search. Jeff, thanks for mentioning the SOPACT. SOPACT is something that we at Spring have drawn from. SOPACT, I think, is an interesting one. It does not get as much visibility and as much credit as I think it should from my personal perspective. And so I'm actually glad that you raised that. It's good to know that you're using it because we've used it sometimes, especially in some of the work that we've done in other countries. We mentioned SOPACT and people kind of look at us cross-eyed. So it's good to see that it's getting a bit of airtime.
Can I ask about this real quick? I mean, I'm
Please.
curious about like this is language and platforms that I don't recognize. And I think it's partly maybe because I work in like a movement organizing space versus like a business, like impact investing. Like there's no business returns or everybody's supported largely on grant money or by like individual donations. Like, but I'm wondering like how do you see these applying to other, like, are these very business related metrics or like, do they apply to like, like social sector where people are measuring, like workers' power, or they're measuring like policy wins, or they're measuring like how many people you can turn out to call your elected officials, or like, does it apply, or is it really locked into kind of like people that have a business model with money? And
so I'm gonna give my perspective on this. And so Sarah, by the way, thanks for sharing that link to GERS as well. I think Iris Plus has very little to do with being for profit or being a business venture. There's so many metrics within the Iris Plus framework that have nothing to do with economic model. Now, what I would say to you is even at 650-ish, there's not a, oh, amazing. Thanks, Sarah, on that link for impact management project. Most of these tools, I would say, have metrics that can be universally applied. And so I would encourage you to dig in. I would just encourage you, Deborah, to, when you dig into Iris Plus, they have a couple of really good articles that are kind of like introduction to the framework and the methodology, and those are a good read. But when you actually dig into the framework, like, have your favorite beverage at your side. It could be a glass of wine or a case of beer or, a great smoothie, whatever it is, but you're going to hunker down for a little while. Okay. And so my encouragement always with Iris Plus is understand where they're coming from, dig into individual components, like some of the categorization that they have, maybe just kind of dig in one at a time, because it can be a real rabbit hole. And we do live in this kind of binge watching kind of society now, and you could literally burn a whole weekend trying to dig in on that stuff. So so I just encourage you to think about that a little bit. So
and if you work in kind of other spaces like social movement spaces, because I'm just thinking this is really interesting. I've never even heard this language of these platforms. And, you know, I give presentations to funders and sit through all kinds of, and I'm like, this is fascinating. There's like a whole framework that like no one in my space even refers to.
Yep. Yeah. And one thing I'll say to you, Deborah, is when I started Spring, and the very first time I went to an impact investing conference, which was actually just outside of Seattle, and in that conference, people just kept talking about gin. They're like, gin, and I'm like, geez, these bunch of alcoholics here. Like, what are they talking about? You know, like you just have no idea. Like what's so. It is a like I think sometimes in the impact world we're a little bit like the tech startup world. Like there's a little bit of acronym soup that comes into play. And so my comment to you is be fearless when you hear an acronym. If somebody says X, like for example, GIN is the Global Impact Investing Network, right? I don't even know what IRIS stands for, to be perfectly honest. And I just know that's where I can go for great impact metrics. And so the reason I mention that is I just think it's really valuable to anytime somebody uses an acronym in this space, just be like, what's that? Like, who's that? What's that? What does that mean? Do I care? Should I care? Right? I think it's really, really valuable. Yeah, if you're fearless about asking, it really helps. Now, what I would say, if I circle back, for example, and I'm going to make a couple of comments here just for argument's sake. You know, in Keith's case, Keith could totally pull, based on what you described, you could pull specific metrics from both Iris Plus and Project Drawdown for what this company is doing in Kenya. Absolutely. Just don't try and pull 100. Start with 5, right? Like, and what are the 5 most important? So be fearless to say, well, what do we think are the kind of the big ones? And you kind of come up with about 20. And I have a rule of thumb, like if you have 20 metrics or 30 or 60, and this is actually what I did with the Swiss government. They had 68 metrics, and I put a spreadsheet up and I said, so here are your metrics. And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, are they important? They're like, yeah. And I literally took a line and I cut the page and I said, here's 34. What are we missing? And then they were like, you know, and then literally within 2 minutes, they're all like, yeah, nothing. Okay, great. So then the 34, I took it and I cut it in half again. And I'm like, here's 17. What do you think? And then the arms started going up, right? And so Keith, I would encourage you to do the same thing with this company in Kenya. Is like, if they have 20 metrics, say to yourself, well, what's really important? What are the big ones, the big 5 or the big 7? Now, in Hedda's case, with YGAP, one thing I would really honor is that YGAP does phenomenal work in the Pacific Islands. And what I would say is, in tools like Project Drawdown and Iris Plus, there can be a phenomenal amount of colonial language and colonial terms and colonial metrics. And so in Hedda's case, I would say these are great tools to draw on as resources, but you almost want to start with a blank sheet of paper and say, in the context of this community and this culture and this environment, what is actually important? Then what you can do is you can kind of, in a way, stress test a little bit against Iris Plus and Project Drawdown and say, is there anything we're missing? Have we thought about this? What about this? And I just think it's really important. And just as an aside for everybody, you know, we just recently completed a project with YGAP in Vanuatu, and that was for me, it was a tremendous learning experience for us to see that in action and how you can bring, decolonizing language into the process that we're all trying to do. So bit of a sidebar, but for Hedda, that's a comment. You probably are experiencing that on a regular basis, and really, I know YGAP's already doing great work on that front. So sorry, I will back up one more thing, and then I'm going to actually move into closing. Yeah, Hedda, thank you for mentioning that. We struggle with it at a tremendous level, because sometimes even within Iris Plus, and we have seen sometimes it can be, there are certain metrics that we have found to be at least a little bit oppressive from a gender lens perspective. And then in Canada, we have the very good fortune of I think, being quite progressive on a global scale as it relates to reconciliation with Indigenous communities. But the challenge is to get to economic reconciliation. These metrics are completely out of whack with Indigenous communities in Canada, and so we need to really kind of walk that journey. Deborah, you will find equity measurements in some of the frameworks. Off the top of my head, at 6:20 p.m. my time, I can't think of it specifically, but it's probably there. So the last thing I wanted to mention, and Jeff touched on this, it was I think implied, so Jeff can comment, but I'm going to make it explicit, which is Jeff maintains an active community, alumni community. And the reason is because Jeff has to maintain an active alumni community because he has future programs that they can offer, right? And so my comment to you is, we at Spring are incredibly active with our community. And I would argue that for all of you, you want to be incredibly active with your community. And the reason is because that's where we can establish fair exchange of value to continue to access data. And so one example that I would give you, and all, like, for those people who are members of Communers, you know this, like, we all get at least one email a week from Sarah. What she is doing is she is establishing fair exchange of value so that when she asks us for data, we're like, yeah, okay, we're good, right? So in our particular case at Spring, there's a few ways that we do this. So we have a full-time community manager at Spring. They're actively working with our communities, which include entrepreneur community, investor community, ecosystem community, and then donor, funder, corporate sponsor community, right? So we kind of have four main communities that they work with. Amongst other things, we have an online community hub. We also have specific alumni programs, very similar to Jeff, so we can have people go from idea stage to incubation to acceleration, or with partners like Deborah. You know, currently you're doing, you know, kind of a certain block of work with the New Power organizations. Over time, you're going to have follow-on activities, programs, supports, etc. So this is where you will establish fair exchange of value. And the way that we measure it, just to be clear, is we're super clear on this. Number one metric is referral rate. So of the people in our communities, what percentage of those people refer people? And when we run a program, whether it's an entrepreneur program or an ESO program or an investor program, what percentage of the participants came through referrals? That is an outstanding way for us to measure engagement. In addition to that, yes, because we have an online community hub, we can measure engagement on the online community hub. And just for everybody's reference, the platform that we use is Tribe. Mighty Networks is another great example. And what I would say to everybody is, I, as the CEO of Spring, am completely ambivalent about Tribe. Not that it's good or bad, I could care less. It's a tool in a toolbox is what I'm saying, right? Could be Tribe, could be Mighty Networks, could be a closed Facebook group, could be an email list, could be a WhatsApp group. Pick the platform of your choosing that makes sense for you. In our case, Tribe works well. And so the other thing that this was interesting in the earlier session, people were really excited about this last piece that I mentioned here, which is introductions made. And so introductions made, we actually track every introduction we make. So if an entrepreneur asks to meet an investor, it goes on the list. If a mentor asks to meet another mentor, it goes on the list. Everything goes on the list. And just so you know, I was in this situation with a donor. This is back in 2017. And so they asked the question, like, they were kind of talking to us, and it was corporate sponsored, just to be clear. And the corporate sponsor said, hey, you know, this has been great, but, like, you know, so how many introductions did we get? And so I was like, good question, I'll come back to you. So I went to the team and I'm like, everybody go through your sent items, go find them. And so, but a funny thing happened. I always start my introductions with introductions and. Those are the first two words in the subject line. So what I actually did was I actually went into my sent items and I looked for introductions and. And true story, in 2017, I alone made 723 introductions. So 2 a day, every day for a year. That was just me, not let alone the rest of the team. So then we went back to the corporate sponsor and we said, hey, thanks for asking. In the last year, we've actually made 173 introductions to your organization. They're like, what? You know, and that actually reinforced that we were actually doing that, right? So just an interesting impact metric that we don't consider to be an impact metric per se, but some people care. They kind of care, like, what, you know, what is that activity that we're doing and why? So last piece I want to touch on very quickly is storytelling. This came up earlier. It is critical to our process. Storytelling is the #1 way for us to measure qualitative impact, is that we tell the stories. We get entrepreneurs and we get organizations and we get investors to talk about what they were when they came to us, what happened in the middle, what happened after the fact, right? And so the important part is to go through that storytelling aspect. And that is a crucial part. And so my last comment on Swiss EP is the big reason why we were able to go from 68 metrics down to 27, of which 7 were primaries, because we added stories. So what we started to do was we started to collect stories in every community that Swiss EP serves. And so now if you go to Swiss EP's LinkedIn page, and if you go to Swiss EP's website, you'll see that they're pushing out stories every month. And what's amazing now is that 2 years in on phase 2, it's considered to be one of the highest performing programs in Swiss Contact overall. And they were originally told, like, they have a hard stop in 2 years and 2 months. They were told last month that they're up for extension and expansion. And so 7 metrics plus stories. So it is the quintessential 1-2 punch, right? So the data gives them the quants, right? And then the stories give them the emotional hit. And it's an incredibly powerful way to drive the process. And we do this actively at Spring on a regular basis as well. So just so you know, as a part of the process we have at Spring, is in every program that we have, the program manager, of course, is measuring satisfaction, net promoter score. Net promoter score of the participants, guest speakers, mentors, but then separately, we're aiming for a percentage. So if everybody's happy and thrilled with the program, great. But we're aiming to try and, if we're doing our job as a program, is we're getting 20% testimonials. I will also tell you that if somebody gets you the testimonials, those are the people that you focus on for fair exchange of value, because they'll continue to give you data for the full extent of the time frame that you require, whether that is 2, 3, 7, whatever duration in terms of years. So I'm gonna pause there. Hey, 2 minutes to spare. So, so I'd love to hear, like, questions, comments, and in particular, what I'd love to hear with Sarah is, coming out of this session, what would you like to dig deeper on? What would you like to learn next? And what would you like to either have access as like a tool or a resource or a template? So pragmatically, like, what can we do to kind of help you continue on this journey?
Hi, Keith here. For me, as this being an exploratory endeavor at this point, I'm going to get in touch certainly with Sarah and bring some vocabulary words and get an understanding of the environment that you exist in, so that I can actually apply those vocabulary words and help get a relational kind of, get my space oriented, you know, if that makes sense, and come up more with a coherent strategy for what I see kind of as a vision, and have been acting unilaterally on, where now I see there's this whole space that I didn't even know existed until, you know, recently. So yeah, I'm grateful. So that's what I'll be doing. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you. That's great. Other questions, comments, asks?
Oh, yes, and this call did change my life. Thank you. Yes, absolutely.
You're my hero. Thank you. By the way, for those who don't yet know me, I put my LinkedIn into the chat. If you want to connect up with me within like a day, that's the fastest way to do it. You know, email. I now say my inbox is Canada Post. You know, it takes 4 days to get to me. By the time you open it after the bills. So just to be, you know, with lots of humility. So LinkedIn is definitely the way to connect and go forward. Other questions, comments, any tools or any resources anybody could use as you dig in?
I would love to see other people's impact reports. Like, I'm really curious how people represent impact. Like, do people put together, you know, yearly impact reports? I'd love to see samples of people from this space, how you represent those metrics.
Fantastic. I will commit, Deborah, to sharing our impact report with you. I might actually have a couple of other examples in my inbox. One of the ones that I'm thinking about is an organization called Canopy Impact, which is really, really cool. So I will commit to doing that. Great. Other comments, asks as we move to wrap?
I just wanted to say thank you, because every time we talk or I listen to you, I always learn something. So this was no exception.
Likewise. Likewise. Yeah, absolutely. No, it's one of the powers of being in this particular group is I feel like every time I talk to Jeff, I learn something. Thank you for saying the same in return, for sure. So it's one of the benefits of being here. Thank you. So cool. Hedda, thank you for joining us at, I guess it's a fairly reasonable time for you, but now you're pushing into the early afternoon, heading into the weekend. So thanks for joining us from Australia. It's amazing.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's been really good.
Thank you. Yeah. Anna, I hope this process has been great as you've been thinking about this kind of charting this new path. One thing I would encourage, Anna, is that you've got, like in this room, you've got an amazing set of organizations overall with conveners, an amazing set of organizations. And so if you're thinking about charting this path in collaboration or working with organizations, like this is definitely a great place to kind of put the word out as to what you're looking for and when and how. So yeah.
No, thank you. This was fantastic. And actually a lot of correlation with my corporate type of job, interesting, similar struggles in some regards. So no, this was great.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Well, everybody, I really appreciate you taking the time. My family is going to be back in about 10 minutes, which means I better get on dinner. So I appreciate you taking the time and joining us today. And again, do reach out to me in LinkedIn. I'd love to connect. If there's anything that I can do to support the journey, it'd be great. Just as an aside, I will definitely be at the Accelerating the Accelerators event that's coming up called Thriving Forward. It's historically been one of the showcase events of SOCAP, and is actually a fun fact. It was actually through Accelerating the Accelerators that we actually secured our first work in Southeast Asia. And so, yeah, wouldn't be where we are today without it. So yeah, awesome.
Awesome. Thank you so
Have
much.
a great evening, everyone.
Thank
you,
you.
everyone.
You as well. Take care. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Speak soon.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.